This is an ABC News special report. The Kavanaugh confirmation vote. Now reporting, David Muir.
Good morning, and we're coming on the air at this hour with breaking news. A crucial vote on Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh is now underway on Capitol Hill. The Senate is voting right now on whether to advance Judge Kavanaugh's nomination to a final confirmation. That final vote could then come as early as tomorrow, but this vote is crucial right now in order for that to happen. All eyes are still on four undecided senators, Republican Senators Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski, and Jeff Flake, who just voted aye, agreeing to move this forward. We're also watching Democratic Senator Joe Manchin this morning from West Virginia. He has said that he has not decided before arriving in the chamber this morning. Senator Collins revealing a short time ago that she will vote yes this morning, and in fact she has, to advance the confirmation, but that she will then reveal her final decision, yes or no, on Kavanaugh on the Senate floor later this afternoon. Senate Judiciary Chairman Chuck Grassley this morning telling our Mary Bruce that, quote, "We don't know how it's going to go until these votes get cast." Judge Kavanaugh, of course, pleading his own case again in the Wall Street Journal in an op-ed, writing his fiery testimony, quote, might have been too emotional, answering questions about his temperament that he knows still exists for some of these senators. It's now up to the senators to decide. Millions of Americans, their constituents back home, will be watching and listening here this morning. Of course, President Trump watching this very closely as well. And let's listen into the vote again. That key vote from Senator Flake moments ago, voting aye to move this forward. Of course, we now wait on some of the other undecided senators who will determine the way this goes.
Mr. Reed. Mr. Risch. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Rounds. Aye. Mr. Rubio.
Of course, as we listen in the Senate chamber, it can sometimes be difficult to hear the actual
Sanders.
vote. Instead, hearing the senators'
Mr.
names
Sass.
as they're called. And watching this with me is our senior congressional correspondent, Mary
Mr.
Bruce, this
Schatz.
morning. And Mary, we were taking note that a short time ago, Senators
Schumer.
Collins and Murkowski both entered. They did not enter together, but they are seated
Scott.
somewhat close to one another, and they were seen talking to one another, whispering into each other's ears.
Yeah, David, always interesting to see the body language here between these key undecided votes, those key senators we've been watching so closely in these past few days. And I have to say, one of the things that strikes me so much this morning is how truly so many of these senators were still wrestling with this decision, not just about the politics here, but genuinely so many of these undecided votes seem to really be struggling with this. We saw Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia this morning going in one more time into that secure room in the basement of the Capitol to take another look at that FBI report on Judge Kavanaugh's alleged allegations of sexual misconduct. He told reporters that he genuinely didn't think he was going to know how he was going to vote until he walked through the doors here today.
Some breaking news, Mary. While you were reporting in, we heard Senator Murkowski vote no to this cloture vote, saying that she does not believe this should move forward to the next vote. And of course, she's been one of those key senators who we did not know which way she would go. Of course, she's a senator from Alaska, and it had been reported that victims of sexual assault had been in her office yesterday. She didn't publicize it, but that they were there. And as we know, senators on Capitol Hill have been receiving many calls since the testimony of Dr. Christine Blasey Ford last week. Again, Murkowski meeting with some of those victims in the last 24 hours, it's been reported, and this morning voting no on this cloture vote. And if you recall, it was Senator Murkowski who said before the testimony last week from both Brett Kavanaugh and from Dr. Ford that, quote, "We are now in a place where it's not about whether or not Judge Kavanaugh is qualified. It's about whether or not a woman who has been a victim at some point in her life is to be believed." And Mary, this is significant. Senator Murkowski, a no this morning.
It is significant, and there have been signs, as you mentioned, that she might be making this vote. She has been under tremendous pressure from her constituents. We've been seeing protesters camped out nearly nonstop, it seems, outside of her office here on the Hill. And it's something really, as you mentioned, that's been different about this debate that we've seen here on the Hill. The level of interaction between protesters and these key undecided votes, these key swing votes, has been really something to watch, something tremendous. We've seen protesters, not just here, on the streets outside of Washington, but actually engaging senators directly, taking their case to their representatives, either urging them to support or to say or to vote against Judge Kavanaugh. But Lisa Murkowski under tremendous pressure, like so many others, and now we know that she is voting no today to advance this debate.
Just help viewers at home, Mary, understand how this works. Obviously, these are the rules of the Senate playing out in front of America today, millions watching, because a no vote this morning on this cloture vote does not necessarily mean a no vote on the final vote. So talk us through this. Senator Murkowski voting no this morning, Senator Collins voting yes, but then she'll speak on the Senate floor later today about her final vote.
Yeah, this is a procedural vote, essentially to advance Judge Kavanaugh's nomination and to end the debate. How senators vote today does not necessarily indicate how they will vote on final passage. Now, if this vote to invoke cloture goes through, then it means that they will likely vote on final passage sometime tomorrow afternoon. But you mentioned Susan Collins. We know that she is a yes now to this vote, but that means she could still technically vote no tomorrow, although that does seem like it would be unlikely given some of the signs that we have seen coming from her. Susan Collins yesterday coming out after viewing that FBI report, saying that she thought it was a thorough investigation. But it will be interesting to see what she has to say later this afternoon, David.
All right.
And Wyden. Mr. Sanders, no. Mr. Lee, aye. Ms. Hassan, no.
As we listen in here, now polling some of the Democratic senators, this is not typical, the procedure that's underway here this morning, so we're trying to keep close watch on what it is we're witnessing. We do know that the Democratic Senator Joe Manchin, who I mentioned, was one of the undecideds going into this morning, voting yes to this cloture vote, which again simply means that he's voting yes, that we move on to the next step, to a final vote that could come as early as tomorrow. There's a lot of pressure on Senator Manchin. He comes from West Virginia, where President Trump won handily in the 2016 election. Manchin, though, is a Democrat and has been deliberating, and as Mary reported here this morning, had been in the SCIF, that secure room
Mr. Schumer,
where the findings of that FBI investigation are under lock and key. He said he was undecided and that he wanted to go look at the findings of that report again before heading into this room to vote.
Mr. Donnelly.
Our veteran journalist, Cokie Roberts, watching this unfold this morning. And Cokie, this is slightly different from what we normally see.
David, normally when senators take a vote, they're wandering on and off the floor, they're talking to each other, there are only 3 or 4 on the floor at the same time. Here they're sitting in their seats, listening, serious, calm, standing to vote. This is a very, very serious proceeding, and they know it, and that's why they're behaving in this fashion. They're all there, and they're taking this quite seriously. Normally, I have to tell you, with the cloture vote, this is the vote to end debate, that if you vote yes on cloture, it means taking it to the next step. It usually also does mean you're going to vote for the bill or the nominee or whatever. If you vote no on cloture, you're saying, I don't even want to take it to the next step. So it's very, very unlikely that you would then vote for the nominee. So the fact that Lisa Murkowski has voted no is highly significant. The fact that Joe Manchin and Susan Collins have voted yes is probably also quite significant, but not quite as significant.
Well, we do believe that the Republicans have the 50 votes they were looking for cloture. But as Cokie just mentioned, sometimes this initial vote for cloture is an indicator of what's to come. And so for Lisa Murkowski, Cokie, this was significant that she was a no vote this morning, and from Joe Manchin, a yes.
Mr. Reed.
He could possibly be one of the senators who helps bring Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court.
the senator. He could be the senator who does that. He's in a very, very tough re-election race right now. Lisa Murkowski is not up this year, but you know she knows how to work Alaska. She lost her primary the last time she ran, and then ran as a write-in candidate. So she's not as fearful of the Republican base as some of the others are. Susan Collins, I'm told that if she votes against Kavanaugh, that she's unlikely to ever be nominated again by the Republican Party in the state of Maine. So they've all got their own calculations to worry about, not just in terms of self-preservation, but in terms of what they think they can do for their states in the Senate.
John Carl watching with us this morning, our senior White House correspondent. And John, what are we to read into Senator Susan Collins revealing that she would vote yes this morning to cloture, but that she would appear later on this afternoon and deliver a speech about whatever it is her final decision will be?
I think it's nearly impossible to imagine that Susan Collins would vote yes on this, the critical vote, and then change her mind or vote differently on the final vote. She has her big speech at 3 o'clock. The most immediate impact of her saying that she is not announcing yet how she will vote on the final vote, I think, is a way to make sure that there is a little bit of drama left and there's a lot of attention, and we will all be watching her speech. I'm sure she has a lot to say, but I completely agree with what Mary Bruce has said about all of Collins' comments and now this vote. They all point in the direction of her voting yes on the final confirmation. I think what we have seen here, David, is we have seen that Brett Kavanaugh will be a Supreme Court justice.
John Carl watching this morning. And again, that key and crucial vote, as Koki was saying, Senator Joe Manchin, Democrat of West Virginia. Of course, it's not his final vote, but he did vote yes this morning to end the debate into whether or not Brett Kavanaugh should be appointed to the court. And as John Carl just said, some very strong indicators this morning that it looks like Brett Kavanaugh will be the next Supreme Court justice. If that does happen, that swing seat on the Supreme Court will shift that court to a more conservative leaning for a generation. A monumental move and an historic moment. We're watching the first round of this, though, play out now. And of course, it's no guarantee of what could come as early as tomorrow, but some very strong indicators that what we're witnessing this morning is very positive for both Brett Kavanaugh and for President Trump and the White House, which is watching this very closely. I do want to bring in Terry Moran, who has covered the Supreme Court for years for us here at ABC. And Terry, it wasn't lost on you that it is very rare. Perhaps we haven't seen this in our lifetime when a retired Supreme Court justice weighs in on the eve of this cloture vote. Retired Justice John Paul Stevens at an event that had been planned for some time. It's not as though he planned to say this on the eve of this vote. But he did reveal that he changed his views for reasons that had no relationship to Brett Kavanaugh's intellectual ability.
Carper.
But he did reveal in the last 24 hours that, quote, I feel his performance in the hearings ultimately changed my mind and disqualified him for the Supreme Court.
That was an extraordinary rebuke, David. John Paul Stevens, the Associate Justice, longtime appointed by President Ford, a lifelong Republican, voted liberal, but was seen on this court by all of the other members as very cordial, very correct in the way he approached a justice's duties. And for him to come forward on Brett Kavanaugh in particular, a judge, an appellate court judge here in Washington, known to these justices. They socialized with him, a rising star for a generation among conservative lawyers. For him to come out and say his performance at the hearing changed my mind, and to say it publicly,
as a reminder
that
to
was
our
a rebuke.
guests in the galleries, expressions of approval or disapproval are not permitted in the Senate galleries. On this vote, the yeas are 51, the noes are 49. The motion is agreed to.
And so there you have it. The votes are there to invoke cloture. We just heard the gavel there moments ago. They have now voted to end debate into nominee Judge Brett Kavanaugh. This now sets things in motion for an historic vote as early as tomorrow, which could lead to Brett Kavanaugh becoming the next Supreme Court justice. There was a very key vote this morning, and of course it's not a guarantee of which way he'll go tomorrow. But Senator Joe Manchin, John Carl, voted yes this morning, and he said to reporters just this morning that he was not ready, he was undecided, and that he headed back into that room where the findings of this FBI investigation still remain locked up.
He actually said that he was going to remain undecided until he walked into the chamber for that vote. And then adding some drama, he didn't vote when his name was first called. He was one of the final senators to cast their vote. And what Manchin does, first of all, if he had voted no, this still would have passed. They would have needed the tie-breaking vote by the vice president. But what it does is it makes this not quite a total partisan vote. You have a single Democrat that has voted to move forward on Brett Kavanaugh, likely to vote to confirm Brett Kavanaugh. Without that single vote, a senator from West Virginia, a state that Donald Trump won in a landslide, without that single vote, we would see here, we'd be headed towards the first Supreme Court justice to be confirmed strictly on party lines. This is about as close as you can get, a single vote from the other side. It's such a break with history, with precedent, David. Neil Gorsuch had 3 Democratic votes and all of the Republicans. That was, until then, the most partisan vote we have ever seen. But remember, the way it has been throughout history is that Supreme Court nominees have been confirmed by wide bipartisan margins. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, hero to liberals, won confirmation with only 3 senators voting no. Antonin Scalia, hero to conservatives, was confirmed to the Supreme Court, 98-0, not a single no vote. Now here we are at a state reflecting the divide, the political divide in our country, reflecting what we saw with these hearings. We have a Supreme Court nominee headed towards what will be, I would argue, would be an almost certain confirmation, but with just a single vote from the other political party, just a single vote. Otherwise, party line.
Party line with the addition of 1 Democrat. Joe Manchin, as you point out, being a significant and key vote. They did not need the vice president to put them over the top in this case. Joe Manchin from West Virginia, a Democrat, obviously helping them to get the 51 votes that they needed. But as John Carl was reporting, so much of this we have not seen before in the proceedings leading up to the next Supreme Court justice. We saw Mary Bruce, this nominee, do a sit-down interview with his wife, which was something we had not seen before. We saw the op-ed in the Wall Street Journal in this 11th hour actually talking about his temperament and suggesting that perhaps he was too emotional at times. And that op-ed, though, in a national newspaper, was likely geared straight to those 4 senators who were undecided, who might also have been deliberating this issue of temperament that was raised, in addition to these allegations that were raised against him by Dr. Christine Blasey Ford. There was then the debate over temperament, how he displayed himself in front of the Senate Judiciary hearing. And you can see the quote right up on the screen from that Wall Street Journal op-ed. I might have been too emotional at times. I know that my tone was sharp, and I said a few things I should not have said. But an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal and a sit-down interview with his wife, simply things we have not seen before, Mary.
A remarkable way to have a Supreme Court nominee deliver his closing argument here. And it was not just to the American public, but it was very clearly aimed also at those undecided key swing votes. Kavanaugh hitting on some of their concerns about his temperament, about his tone, about how forceful his testimony was here on the Hill last week. And of course, those concerns about his partisan attacks on his political opponents. Kavanaugh very clearly laying out in that op-ed, trying to defend himself, defend his testimony, and interestingly making that admission that he said some things that he should not have said. It will be interesting as we go and chase down some of these senators after the vote to hear what they thought of Kavanaugh's final argument there, whether that played any role in their decision making here. Because when you look at those 4 undecideds, 3 of them, Senator Collins, Senator Flake, Senator Manchin, now being a yes to support his confirmation. David, ultimately, if the Senate votes tomorrow on final passage, as they did here today, Judge Kavanaugh, of course, will be confirmed.
No question about it, and that's the bottom line of what we've seen here this morning. If it's an indicator of what's to come tomorrow, Brett Kavanaugh will be the next justice on the Supreme Court. As Mary Bruce just points out, 3 of the 4 undecided senators voting yes to cloture this morning to end the debate into Brett Kavanaugh. 3 of the 4. The only one to vote no was Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, Republican senator from Alaska. They have all been facing significant pressure from constituents back home who are really divided. This country extremely divided on this choice for the Supreme Court, not unlike what we saw in 2016. But we did say, and Mary was talking about this moments ago, in that op-ed, he was talking directly to these senators, and in doing so to the American people, about the temperament he displayed in front of that Senate Judiciary Committee a week ago, answering questions about the allegations about his behavior back in his college days and during his high school years. We saw that moment where Senator Klobuchar had asked him a question about whether or not he'd ever blacked out, and asked him whether or not he remembered drinking too much at times, and he turned the questioning around and said, "I don't know, have you, Senator?" It was uncomfortable to watch for many Americans. It's a moment that played again and again on cable news and in news reports that followed, that brought up this question of temperament. And Terry Moran, I wanted to bring you back in, because this was the quote in his opening statement. This was not the reaction to a question that was asked of him, but this was something in his scripted, prepared statement. He said, "This whole 2-week effort has been a calculated and orchestrated political hit fueled with apparent pent-up anger about President Trump and the 2016 election, fear that has been unfairly stoked about my judicial record, revenge on behalf of the Clintons." And you are a veteran of the court. Have you ever heard a nominee talk in such sharp, partisan terms? And again, these were his prepared statements.
That's right. Then that's an important point. And Brett Kavanaugh is a writer. He writes as a judge. That's what he does every day. I'm old enough to have covered the Bork nomination, the Clarence Thomas nomination. They were angry at what was happening to them. It never became as nakedly partisan as what Kavanaugh said there. And I think that's what Justice John Paul Stevens was remarking on. When you talk about the anger and the tears, those are understandable emotions, I think, for a man who was saying he was falsely accused of something in front of his family and the world, and that was incredibly painful. So anger and tears were a natural reaction to that. It's what those anger and tears revealed beneath, I think, that had people concerned. Brett Kavanaugh was a loyal, partisan Republican lawyer for Ken Starr in the Florida election contest, in the Bush-Gore election, in the Bush White House. And I think that people were concerned about what was revealed about his partisanship, not as much about the emotions.
Terry Moran, stay with us. He's live with us from the Supreme Court. We are on the air with breaking coverage this morning of a crucial vote involving Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh. It is now 11 a.m. here in the East, 8 a.m. in the West, and I want to play you the moment ago on the Senate floor. This moment was crucial in pushing Brett Kavanaugh closer to that post on the Supreme Court. Take a look.
Thank you. On this vote, the yeas are 51, the noes are 49. The motion is agreed to.
You heard the gavel there just moments ago. 51 votes to now limit this debate. Of course, senators can change their vote between today and the final vote, which could come as early as tomorrow. It's rare that that actually happens. And Senator Joe Manchin, a Democrat from West Virginia, helping them to get those 51 votes, but was the only Democrat to vote yes to push this forward, this nomination of Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court. Of the 4 undecided senators who we have been watching very closely over the past 24 hours, only one voted no. Lisa Murkowski, Republican senator of Maine, who voted no in moving this forward. We do know that she, like so many senators, has heard from constituents back home and has heard from survivors of sexual assault. It's been reported that she met with some in her office just yesterday, and there have been so many of those poignant moments over the course of the last week or so. We saw Jeff Flake in the elevator just before the hearings last week, where survivors of sexual assault approached him in the elevator. One of the women saying, "Look at me when I'm talking to you." And it's widely believed that it was that moment that then led Senator Jeff Flake with his colleagues on the Senate Judiciary Committee. He then joined Democrats in pushing for this 1-week pause. His colleague and friend from across the aisle, Senator Chris Coons, suggesting that. Jeff Flake then going along with the idea and really change the course of this whole process. That's the whole reason there was an additional week for that FBI investigation. Many Republicans have come out to say that they believe the FBI investigation not only was thorough and complete, but did not offer any corroborating evidence to Dr. Christine Blasey Ford's testimony. Though the argument from Democrats, some calling this a sham, saying that many of the names that were put forward who could have corroborated Dr. Ford's testimony and the testimony of Deborah Ramirez, although she didn't testify but did talk with the FBI, that many of the names put forward that could help back up their stories simply were not reached out to by the FBI. Ultimately, questions about whether or not the White House controlled who they could talk to and why this was 10 or so people who were reached by the FBI and why that number wasn't greater than that. That will be something debated for some time to come. You see the tweet there at the bottom of your screen. President Trump tweeting, very proud of the U.S. Senate for voting yes to advance the nomination of Judge Brett Kavanaugh. Again, debate can still continue, but this certainly minimizes it and now pushes forward this final vote, which could come as early as tomorrow. And strong indicators today, as John Carl reported, this very well means that Judge Brett Kavanaugh could be the next Supreme Court justice. It would be an historic shift for the court. He now would occupy that swing seat. The court would then lean conservative and likely for generations to come. I want to bring in Cokie Roberts because, Cokie, ultimately, the other question here is about how women around this country are seeing this vote here this morning. Not just women, but men. There are many men who have survived sexual assault as well. But the women who have come to the Capitol, they came from Alaska, they came from Maine, they came from all over this country to try to influence some of those senators who were undecided, some of those four. And what do you suppose, how are they receiving where this is headed this morning?
Well, I'm sure that you're going to see very stark and emotional reactions to this. But, you know, we've been seeing anyway, even before this this very contentious hearing, a big gap between the way men and women are reacting to Judge Kavanaugh. Of course, it's not as big as the partisan gap, with Republicans supporting him, Democrats not. But there is also a female gap, particularly among independents. And so you're going to see a reaction to this. It is not fair for Judge Kavanaugh to bear the weight of all of the women who have been sexually harassed in history. But that is part of what has been going on here. And again, his response to it exacerbated it. But you know, David, even beyond what it means for women in the election and all of that, we have real problems now with two of our major institutions of government. You have a man who's very likely to join the Supreme Court, who, despite his op-ed in the Wall Street Journal today saying that he would be a fair and impartial judge, testified in a very, very partisan fashion before the Senate. And you have a Senate that is so divided that you had, as we've said earlier, one Democratic vote for Kavanaugh, one Republican vote essentially against him. You know, throughout much of our history, the Senate voice voted members of the Supreme Court. They didn't even call the roll. They just said fine. And that is just gone. And the speeches that we heard today leading up to this vote from the leaders of the Senate, the two leaders of the Judiciary Committee, and then the two leaders of the Senate, Chuck Schumer, Democrat of New York, Mitch McConnell, Republican of Kentucky, were so partisan against each other and accusing hard right and hard left groups of influencing the members. It's going to be very, very hard for the Senate to come back from this nomination in a way that they can cooperate with each other. And it's going to be very, very hard for the court because they're going to have a certain cloud over them.
Such an important point, Cokie. I want to bring Terry Moran on what Cokie Roberts was just pointing out, Terry. And it's so true that we have not heard the partisan rhetoric when it comes to a Supreme Court nominee used by that nominee himself, let alone the Senate Judiciary Committee. And as Cokie was alluding to, we heard from Chuck Grassley this morning and then Dianne Feinstein. Clearly the partisan lines drawn. And you would somewhat expect that in this moment in our country from the Senate and certainly from the White House. But the Supreme Court itself has been somewhat insulated from that for so many years. And I'd be so curious, although we might never know, so curious what the justices on the court think of what they've witnessed over the course of the last week or two.
That's a great question, David. My hunch is they dread what's happening, however they feel about Brett Kavanaugh. This place still has a very high estimation in the opinion of most Americans. They respect the Supreme Court for the most part. It has damaged itself in recent years with a couple of rulings in our partisan times that one side or the other didn't like. But you notice the Supreme Court doesn't have any way of enforcing its opinions except its own legitimacy in the minds and hearts of Americans. And I think when it gets dragged into basically the partisan sewer, that mud fight that we're all in, it harms this court. Chief Justice John Roberts is an institutionalist. He has practiced here for 30 years before he became Chief Justice. He loves this institution. I know whatever he thinks about Brett Kavanaugh, he will be concerned going forward. How do I protect that reputation, which at the end of the day is the true source of the court's authority?
Terry Moran, our thanks to you again. And I want to bring in Mary Bruce, some interesting color coming into us from the chamber from our reporter Trish Turner, who's inside Mary. Senators Collins and Murkowski, who have been side by side throughout much of these proceedings, were greeted right after the vote. Senators of both parties coming over to shake their hands. And we would have to note this morning, obviously, that the two women voted differently.
Yeah, Trish, in the room, they're reporting that they were greeted by both parties like celebrities, obviously for very different reasons. Democrats coming over to shake Lisa Murkowski's hand, the Republican from Alaska who joined Democrats in voting no on Kavanaugh just now. And of course, Republicans then coming over to shake Susan Collins' hand, the Republican of Maine, who of course made that incredible, difficult decision. We know this is one that she's really been wrestling with for the last several weeks and days. She's been meeting with constituents in her office, meeting with people on both sides of this debate, trying to wrestle with what she was going to do. Today, of course, joining her party in supporting Brett Kavanaugh.
Mary Bruce, our thanks to you again. And John Carl, bottom line here this morning, 51 votes to minimize the debate as we move forward and to move closer to that final vote on Brett Kavanaugh. It is looking clearer by the moment that Brett Kavanaugh could very well be the next Supreme Court justice. They have got to be happy over at the White House.
Absolutely, and there's also been a clear political impact here as well, David. If you look at the senators that were in play here, so many from states that Donald Trump carried dramatically. Republicans believe that this vote has energized their core supporters, in a way that makes the election looking a lot more positive for Republicans, especially in the Senate races, than it did before this whole controversy over Kavanaugh erupted. All
right, John Carl, Cokie Roberts, Mary Bruce, Terry Moran, our thanks to all of you joining us for this live coverage this morning. An historic moment. Voting yes to cloture, which simply means they will now close the debate on Brett Kavanaugh. For the most part, they will move even closer to that final vote, which could come as early as tomorrow. And it very much looks like Brett Kavanaugh must be relieved this morning. It looks like there is a very good chance that he will be approved for the Supreme Court. We will have team coverage of this historic moment in our nation's capital later on World News Tonight. And for many of you, we return you to our regular programming. For many, it's GMA. And we'll see you later on today. Good day.
This has been a special report from ABC News.